Adaptive reuse has become an important revenue stream for AEC firms, especially during the recent pandemic that has left so much vacant real estate in its wake. Joining us today is Ann Holford-Smith, a partner with PBDW Architects in New York, whose career has focused on the interplay between new and old across a full range of architectural conditions that includes adaptive reuse for existing buildings. Ann is also the commissioner of New York City's Landmarks Preservation Commission. And welcome to the Weekly.
John, it's nice to be here. Thank you.
And let's start our discussion by talking about some of the keys to any successful architectural update.
Well, to start with, it's really important to understand the defining characteristics of the existing building that you're going to work with. We often call this the building's DNA. Now, some building types lend themselves really well to a specific adaptation, such as taking a school building and converting it into apartments. The tall ceilings, large windows, double-loaded corridors all lend themselves to to a residential conversion. Mm-hmm. In other cases, you need to adapt the program to fit the building, such as where you have a structural system that you have to work around and you have to sort of accommodate your program spaces to work within the structural system of the building. And other times, when it's very important, we actually need to break the DNA of the building when it's important to insert a very specific program element. And we did this at a school where we actually dug underground. It was an individual landmark being converted into a school. We dug underneath it to put in a basketball court because there was nowhere else on the building to put it.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, that was pretty amazing.
Yeah.
So I think a successful adaptive reuse both recognizes what's special about the building and why you want to adapt it, and then how it can be modified to suit the needs of the new use.
Mm-hmm. What are some rules of thumb about assessing a building's structural condition, layout, and systems, and what sometimes gets kind of lost in the sauce here when that process is taking place?
Well, I find that when you're working with an old building, it's really good to have a team who understands old buildings, has experience with them. Structural systems, especially from the late 19th to the early 20th century, really evolved and changed. And so having an understanding of those systems can really help to know what to look for when you're doing a building assessment. Mm. I'll give you an example. A lot of New York buildings of this period have a floor system that's made of terracotta flat arch framing system, right, which is very fragile, and you had to be very careful when you're making floor penetration. Make sure that you keep that structural system intact. So one hole can take out the whole bay if you don't know what you're doing. Mm-hmm. So another example of why working with a team that understands these systems is important. It's also important to look at transitions. So for example, where an interior wall meets an exterior wall, or where the column and beam transitions are, because a lot of these hybrid buildings from the turn of the century used a mix of materials such as cast iron columns with beams that were either heavy timber or built up steel sections. And these transitions can sometimes, hide some unexpected conditions.
Yeah. Talk a little bit about the importance of community input in these types of projects.
Well, for any building that's going to be a community building open to the public, it's really important to get community input because you want to make sure that you get all the constituents' needs addressed. A building owner or an institution who's adapting this existing building may have ideas about what they want to do with classrooms and offices and different program spaces, but getting the community input is important. For instance, if discussing whether you should have more classrooms or more open, flexible space, will have a very different outcome to the building design.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Tell me a little bit about working with clients to get to arrive at an agreed upon design solution. How does that give and take work best?
Well, just as getting the community input is important, you have to work with the client to help them to understand what you can and can't do, or what are the opportunities and constraints in working with an existing building. These buildings all have a context, and so there's a larger context, which is the neighborhood, But the building itself will often tell you what it can and can't do and how best it should be adapted for new use. So it's good to have these dialogues with the client to understand, if you really need to have that basketball court and you really need to put that underneath the building, that's going to be a cost. Maybe, another case you might decide to do something different and sort of work within the constraints of the existing building.
Mm-hmm. Do you find clients to be relatively flexible in when they're having these types of conversations about design solutions, or do they have a set thing in mind generally that you kind of have to follow?
Well, there's usually a program that often comes before the project that's already been established. So there's often that as a starting point.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe that might be more of a wish list. But I think, working as a team together and understanding what every decision means in terms of how you can adapt the building to accommodate that, it's an ongoing dialogue. And so I think, if an institution is working with an old building, I think they understand that there's a give and take to it.
Mm-hmm. Can you point to a recent project that you've worked on that illustrates some of the points that we've touched on in our conversation?
Yeah, well, PBDW has worked for many years with the New York Historical Society, which is a museum on the Upper West Side of New York. Most people might know of it. And early on, working with them, we did a very pivotal project for them. The original building was built around the turn of the century, and it was really designed more like a private clubhouse, mm-hmm. even though it was a public institution. I think over time, it became much more of a public building than it was originally. So it kind of looked like a bank when it was built, with heavy bronze doors and not a very inviting entry. And so what we did to help them change the perception of the institution as being a much more public-facing institution is we literally opened the building entry. So on Central Park West, we took the bronze doors and we folded them back, and we inserted glass doors. Mm. And we took the flanking windows, which were these deeply recessed with steel bars, and we dropped the window sills down to grade and put glass doors in those as well. And so what we created behind that was a glass enclosed vestibule. So it's basically an outdoor space. You walk through the portals of the original masonry facade, and you're in this glass sort of enclosed lobby, and you can see the entire lobby, which we also renovated, removing a series of small rooms that were originally there and creating one large open gallery. And that really helped to signal to the public that this is an open institution that's welcoming and wants to draw you in.
Oh, that's pretty cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. And thanks for spending a couple minutes with us today and talking about this topic, which is of interest to a good number of our readers and our audience.
It's been great talking with you. Thank you so much.
Thanks to our audience for joining us today. This is John Caulfield from Building Design and Construction Magazine.